There is a form of departure that runs deeper than any dramatic breakup. It is not a door slammed in fury, nor the last exchange heavy with pain. It happens when someone quietly fades from your inner landscape, when their name no longer stirs you. Memories no longer ignite you, and you no longer feel compelled to explain, analyze, or be understood. Within your psychological framework, they simply cease to occupy a role. And that precise moment is what unsettles a narcissist most. The devastation of treating them as though they were dead does not stem from outward cruelty, but from its profound A narcissist can withstand your anger. In fact, they depend on it. Your anger confirms they still hold power. Each time you lose control, react, or attempt to prove a point, you unconsciously affirm that they remain embedded in your nervous system. Anger is still energy, and energy, whether positive or negative, nourishes their ego. Conflict functions the same way. Arguments are still connection. When you argue, you share the same psychological field. You are still engaged. You are still activated. For a narcissistic structure, it is not what you think about them that matters, but that you are thinking about them at all. And conflict assures them they still occupy space. Even hatred reinforces their importance. They may assume the victim role, twist the story, or redirect blame, but at least they continue to exist in your internal world. What truly drives them into panic is the complete disappearance of that role. When your silence comes not from pain, but from completion. When you no longer need clarity, conversation, or reaction. When they can no longer provoke an emotional reflex within you. That total silence delivers a chilling message. They no longer exist within your neurological system. They are no longer a threat, no longer a source of hurt, no longer central. And once they are no longer central, their ego loses its anchor. A narcissist does not genuinely fear hatred. Hatred still implies recognition. It still signals impact. What they fear is irrelevance, being unable to evoke a response, being left unspoken. That irrelevance resembles psychological death, because their identity depends on being mirrored, noticed, and reacted to. When you treat them as if they are dead, you are not ending their physical life. You are withdrawing the unconscious acknowledgement they relied upon to sustain their sense of existence. And that is why deliberate indifference is so destabilizing. Not because it is loud, but because it is definitive. It leaves no opening through which they can re-enter. It does not invite another argument. It does not restart the cycle. It simply removes their position within your emotional structure. And when a narcissist realizes they no longer produce any reaction whatsoever, they are forced to confront what they have avoided all their lives, the possibility that they are not as significant as they believed, Mingja, to understand more fully what unfolds within them. We can look through the lens of Carl Jung. Jung suggested that every individual operates between two opposing forces: the persona, the social mask presented to the world, and the shadow, the rejected and hidden aspects containing insecurity, shame, and vulnerability. In a narcissistic structure, the persona is engineered with meticulous care. It is not merely an image, it is armor shielding a fragile ego core. Yet that armor cannot sustain itself. It requires constant reflection to remain stable. In the past, you served as that mirror. Through your attention, devotion, and even your pain, you validated them. You reflected the identity they wished to believe about themselves. Powerful, desirable, irreplaceable. You unconsciously regulated their emotions, calming them when insecure, reassuring them in doubt, supporting them in emptiness. Your presence helped preserve a stability they could not generate alone. Land. When you withdraw from that function, the internal collapse begins. The persona loses its audience. No one remains to confirm, respond to, or balance it. Without reinforcement, the shadow starts to emerge. But this is not healthy energy. It is an uncontrolled surge of suppressed emotions, shame, envy, abandonment, fear, feelings of inadequacy. Lacking the capacity to face these aspects consciously, they respond defensively. Panic is often the first reaction. Your silence is not merely absence, it is the removal of regulation. They may launch a smear campaign, attempting to rewrite events, to repair their public image. If they cannot reclaim you through admiration, they may attempt to diminish you to protect the persona, or they may resort to hoovering, unspent messages, vague apologies, sentimental gestures, to test whether the mirror still reflects. If those attempts fail, some retreat into emotional freeze and avoidance, acting as though they never cared, as if they were the one who withdrew first. Regardless of the external display, one truth remains: when you stop reflecting them, they must face the inner void. For an ego structure dependent on external validation, that void is not simple sadness. It feels like losing protective armor, exposing a fragility they have always worked to conceal. You did not cause this directly. You simply stopped participating in the old dynamic. Yet your withdrawal shattered the mirror, and once broken, the flawless image they depended on cannot survive intact. Manger. Previously, everything within them functioned because there was somewhere to discharge, attach, unload, and cling. You intentionally became the surface onto which they projected what they could not bear to see within themselves. You were the container for the traits they refused to claim. When you step away, they do not only lose a person, they lose the mechanism that helped them avoid self-confrontation. Man's with no one left to project onto, they encounter a paradox. What they once assigned to you begins returning to its source. Projection is an efficient escape from self-awareness. Instead of admitting, I am insecure, it becomes, you make me insecure. Instead of recognizing, I fear abandonment, it transforms into, you betrayed me. Rather than facing their own emptiness or weakness, they construct a narrative in which you are the problem. When you were present, their projections had somewhere to land. Without you, those projections ricochet, like light bouncing back from a mirror. Here, Jung's insight becomes exact. The shadow does not vanish when ignored. It gathers in the dark and resurfaces when the persona can no longer contain it. Remove the mirror, and the mask loses its reinforcement. The rejected parts begin demanding recognition. Mimdia. With no one left to blame, a central pillar of their defense collapses. Blame is not merely social behavior. For many narcissistic structures, it is a form of psychological survival. When they can no longer deposit their pain onto someone else, they are forced to brush against what they resist most, the reality that they contributed to every fracture. Yet rather than move toward accountability, they often rewrite the narrative. At this stage, a smear campaign is not only about discrediting you, but about rescuing the persona from disintegration. They require a new audience to accept their version of events, because if no one does, they are left alone with their own inner voice. And that voice is seldom gentle. It carries shame, humiliation, and the terror of thinking, I am nothing if I am not seen. Menger. Without external regulation of their ego, they may enter a dysregulated state that outsiders interpret as instability. at times distant and cold, at times explosively enraged, at times unusually affectionate, before vanishing again, at times obsessively, proving they are thriving, at times urgently attaching to a new source. This inconsistency is not random. It resembles a system losing equilibrium. They are scrambling to replace the stabilizing function you once provided. Indeed. Published research in the journal Personality and Individual Differences has explored connections between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism and emotional regulation, suggesting that narcissistic style influences how individuals manage and respond to emotional experiences. In simple terms, when the external anchor of regulation disappears, internal instability becomes more exposed. Momde. Jomd. At the center of it all is the shadow they must face. And it is rarely a minor flaw. It is a raw, unprocessed mass of psychological material. Shame stands foremost. Shame is not merely the belief, I did something wrong. It is the conviction I am wrong. I am defective. I am unworthy. Shame. Shame threatens the entire architecture the persona has built. A recent systematic review examining shame and narcissism found that shame is more strongly associated with vulnerable narcissism, while grandiosity may serve as a defense against ego-threatening emotions. This helps explain why, after your withdrawal, some immediately project confidence, boast, or appear triumphant. These displays are shields against shame, not evidence of genuine strength. Emptiness follows shame like a second shadow. This emptiness is not simple sadness. It is the sensation of having no stable core, no internal center to return to. When you were present, shared history, conflict intensity, and artificial reconciliations filled that void. When you step away, the emptiness surfaces like a stripped room, echoing, stark, intolerable. You may see them generating noise, a new relationship, a new project, a public celebration, a revised narrative, not because they have healed, but because they cannot endure silence long enough for truth to rise. Insecurity often reveals itself in subtle ways. It does not usually appear as visible self-doubt. Instead, it can surface as a need to manage perception, controlling the narrative, the image, or whether someone continues to think about them. It may appear through comparison. Who moved on first? Who seems happier? Who came out ahead? Relationships can quietly become systems of measurement. When you emotionally disengage, you step outside that system. You stop keeping score. You leave the arena altogether. That shift can feel destabilizing to someone who relied on comparison as a sense of orientation. Dias. At a deeper level, unresolved abandonment wounds can be activated. Early experiences of rejection, neglect, conditional approval, or humiliation sometimes leave lasting emotional imprints. When someone withdraws calmly and without confrontation, those old patterns may resurface without an outlet. The reaction might look like attempts to reconnect, emotional distance, defensiveness, anger, or reframing the story. Rarely is the feeling described as fear. Instead of expressing vulnerability directly, it may transform into blame or accusations. Acknowledging fear of loss requires openness, and openness can feel threatening to a carefully constructed identity. Research by Brad Bushman and Roy Baumeister has suggested that individuals with high levels of narcissistic traits may respond more aggressively when their self-image feels threatened. Interestingly, criticism is not always the strongest trigger. Sometimes indifference has a greater impact. Silence can communicate a boundary, more powerfully than argument. When someone realizes they no longer have emotional access, it can feel more unsettling than open conflict. And the essential point is this: you did not harm anyone by leaving. You simply removed your participation. Sometimes what disappears is not a person, but a role. If someone is accustomed to affirmation through reaction, a lack of response can feel disorienting. When you step away quietly, without spectacle or prolonged engagement, you introduce a new dynamic. Life continues without drama. No ceremony, no repeated cycles, just distance as a new reality. When silence becomes genuine rather than strategic, it may prompt self-reflection. A public image can be maintained, but internally something shifts. New roles may be adopted, appearing content busy or unaffected, yet the awareness remains that something has changed permanently. A familiar dynamic is no longer available. Some people quickly seek new connections. However, new relationships do not automatically resolve underlying patterns. Replacing one connection with another may provide distraction, but it does not necessarily create deeper self-understanding. The issue is never simply about who stayed or left. Often it relates to whether a person has developed a stable inner foundation capable of honest reflection. Without that center, substitution can feel easier than introspection. Amanda, what is difficult to replace is not physical presence, but the meaning attached to it. Sometimes a partner plays the role of witness, someone who saw both strengths and vulnerabilities. When that witness steps away, it can feel like losing more than companionship. It can feel like losing validation of a certain version of oneself. This creates a paradox. A person may move forward outwardly while still monitoring the past internally. They may speak critically, yet remain curious. They may claim indifference, yet react to signs of your stability. The deeper issue is rarely lingering love alone. Often, it is an unfinished internal process. Endings that are not self-directed can be difficult to integrate. When you choose not to argue, not to return, and not to reopen communication, you leave a space that cannot easily be resolved. Unanswered endings can prompt uncomfortable questions. The question shifts from "why did this happen?" to "who am I without this dynamic?" That form of self-inquiry can be challenging, especially when identity was tied to relational reactions. Ultimately, the story becomes less about conflict and more about growth. It becomes about someone learning to remain connected to themselves while stepping away from patterns that no longer served them. From that point forward, future relationships are built on a different foundation, one rooted not in comparison or reaction, but in clarity and self-awareness. Some too attempt to rewrite the script through smearing. If they persuade enough people that you were at fault, they experience temporary relief. Yet notably, the smear campaign is often directed more at an audience than at you. They seek external validation to stabilize what feels unstable inside. It is an effort to construct a substitute mirror. But regardless of how often the story is retold, one truth remains: you are no longer participating, and your refusal to engage drains their narrative of its force. Some people respond by avoiding the situation entirely. There is no public conflict, no attempts to reconnect, no visible tracking of what the other person is doing. On the surface, everything appears settled. Yet, avoidance is not the same as resolution. It can simply be a way of shutting the door rather than facing what feels empty or unresolved inside. Without strong emotional regulation, A person's sense of self may fluctuate, at times feeling confident and self-assured, at other times quietly. These internal shifts are not caused by you. They reflect a lack of steady inner grounding. Blend. What makes your peace feel complete is not that you are trying to prove anything. It is that you no longer feel the need to, when you begin living well, not to be observed, but because you have reconnected with yourself, you dissolve the old belief that your identity depended on someone else. Your steadiness becomes its own statement. There is no argument, no comparison, no attempt to demonstrate growth, only the reality that you are moving forward independently. For someone who once assumed a central role in your life, seeing you function and grow without their involvement can quietly challenge that assumption. Most important is this: you are not responsible for anyone else's instability. You simply stopped investing in a dynamic that lacked a strong foundation. If another person chooses to reflect and grow, that is their opportunity. But growth requires self-examination and accountability, which not everyone is ready to undertake. Without that willingness, patterns often repeat in new settings. This is where your path separates from theirs. When you step away from an illusion, you are not erasing the other person. You are simply no longer participating in a version of reality that did not feel genuine. But what happens next belongs to them. They may form new relationships, tell new stories, adopt new roles. Yet your quiet exit remains significant, not because you overpowered them, but because you chose not to continue in a role that no longer felt true. At the deepest level, what may feel unsettling is not your absence itself, but your independence. When someone who once defined themselves within a shared dynamic begins defining themselves independently, it shifts the balance. This shift is quiet and understated. It does not celebrate or condemn. It simply exists. Minza? You did not harm anyone by leaving. You stepped out of a situation that no longer aligned with you. In doing so, you allowed both people to stand alone with their own reflections. The real turning point in the story is not how the other person reacts. It is how you change. If you continue focusing on their response, you may remain emotionally tied to the old dynamic. The deeper transformation is yours. Reclaiming your energy from something that no longer matched who you were becoming. The first stage of that transformation is internal separation. Emotional detachment does not mean coldness or indifference. It means gaining the ability to observe without being overwhelmed. There may have been a time when small words, gestures, or silences triggered strong reactions. Gradually, you learned that constant reactivity was exhausting. You discovered how to pause, to create space between what happens and how you respond. That pause becomes freedom. May next come self-containment, the capacity to steady yourself without relying on external reassurance. Perhaps you once explained yourself repeatedly, hoping to be understood, or argued to be validated. Over time, you began trusting your own perception. You no longer needed agreement to confirm your experience. You did not require an apology to recognize that you deserved respect. Your center shifted from outside approval to inner clarity. Finally comes internal closure. It rarely arrives through a final discussion or perfect resolution. It comes when you stop waiting. You stop waiting for understanding, for remorse, for explanations that would make everything feel balanced. You accept that not every story ends the way you imagined. And instead of leaving the ending open, you choose to close it within yourself. At this stage, you begin distinguishing between connection and activation. Not every intense emotion is love. Not every conflict is passion. You are no longer drawn to instability simply because it feels familiar. You seek steadiness, not because it lacks excitement, but because it does not cost you yourself. This marks a fundamental shift in your nervous system, from cycling through emotional extremes to sustaining a baseline of peace. Planed. Run trustingly. As you stabilize, your relationships change. Not because you are trying to elevate yourself, but because you no longer respond to manipulation in the same way. Those who once could pull you into cycles may now find you unreadable or inaccessible. Meanwhile, emotionally mature individuals experience you as grounded and safe. You do not need to announce your growth. Your presence reflects it. Philosophically, this is the transition from reactive living to conscious living. Before, you responded from unhealed wounds. Now, you choose according to your values. That distinction redraws the trajectory of your life. You are no longer defined by how others treat you, but by how you respond. And your responses are no longer automatic. They are deliberate. A further consequence of this evolution is that you begin taking responsibility for your energy in practical ways. You decide who gains access, who holds influence, who enters your private space. You stop opening doors out of fear of disappointing others. You recognize that kindness is not self-erasure, and boundaries are not barriers against the world. They are structures that safeguard you, and be at the deepest level. What you gain is not only distance from a narcissist. You outgrow the version of yourself that once needed rescuing. You understand that you are neither someone's savior nor someone's perpetual victim. You are a person with agency and the capacity to redirect your life. In retrospect, the entire experience can be seen as restructuring, painful yet formative. When viewed this way, the narrative no longer centers on their downfall. It centers on your rebuilding. They may continue repeating patterns, they may seek new mirrors, but you have stepped out of that system. You are no longer part of its machinery. From this new vantage point, you are not only free from them, you are free from the patterns that once anchored you. That is the highest form of maturity in this journey. Not winning a battle, but leaving the battlefield. Not proving you are right, but no longer needing to be right in anyone's eyes. And when you reach that place, you simply live steady, self-governed, and at peace.